Another beautiful day here. Another beautiful day. A beautiful day yesterday, beautiful day today. Well, let's take a look as we continue to talk about providence. If you've been with us, we've been talking about how God relates to the world. And we've talked about general providence. And I suggested that this is how God relates to nature, is through general providence. Now, as we talked about God relating to the world, we saw the Bible's declaration that God is involved in every moment-to-moment of sustaining the universe. That He's not like the deist claims. He didn't just create the world and walk away from it, and He doesn't intervene and interfere, and He's indifferent about it. No, He is by His power at every moment sustaining the world that He created. And so nothing is ever going to fall in on itself into non-existence because God's involved and He upholds everything by the power of His Word. And so we talked about that. Now, we talked about the reality that He, of course, created and sustains all of the forces of nature that we experience. And He respects the integrity of His creation. And so He will oftentimes, even while He's sustaining it, He allows those forces to do what He designed them to do. And but anytime that He wants, He can intervene. And He has intervened, and He does intervene because of His purposes, to accomplish His own purposes in the world. So as we talked about general providence, God's relating to nature, we kind of talked in those terms. But then we started talking about God's special providence. So you got general providence, and then you've got special providence. And special providence is really what we think about when we think about God's involvement in history, in the actions and acts of people. Now, as we think about that then, and where I want to go to it today is thinking about, because we got quite a bit to cover and we're kind of running out of time. I want to first of all talk about, as we talked about God's purpose, the purpose is what we discussed this morning. And that is, the purpose of God is the redemption of everything, particularly human beings. And, sin flipped everything on its head in Genesis chapter 3. God's going to flip everything back. And so God's purpose is working. And His special purpose is going to be accomplished through Christ. And so He sends Christ into the world. And as He is accomplishing His purpose, He intervenes. He has intervened. He continues to intervene. But let's talk about His intervention in the history of humanity up through Christ. So, as we think about that, so God is, the focal point of everything that God is doing is Christ. And Christ is coming to deal with the sin problem, that universal sin problem. And so the focal point of everything is Jesus Christ. And so what did God do to get the world ready for the coming of Christ? Let's think about that. What did God do? What was His plan to get the world ready for Jesus to come? And I will say this, it centers around a group of people. Let me kind of help you. Okay, well, the prophets are announcing it. That's absolutely right. As God is preparing the world for the coming of Jesus, who's the focal point of accomplishing His purposes, He raises up prophets to preach. But kind of think about it, let's kind of move out from the prophets individually to something a little bit bigger. the Hebrew nation, the Israelites. That's right. And so as we think about God's preparatory work of bringing the Messiah into the world, we think about the nation of Israel. God selected, in order to bring the Messiah into the world, God chose to establish a special relationship with the Israelites. And he made them into a nation. And so this is the focus of his preparation, is the people of Israel. Everything that happened in the nation of Israel's history, everything that happened from the beginning unto the end, was calculated by God for one purpose: preparing for the coming Messiah. Preparing for that. And so practically everything that we read in the Old Testament, and really the bulk of the Bible as a whole, is really centered around this one theme: how God prepared the world for the coming of Jesus Christ through the nation of Israel. And so as we watch, then as we read through the Old Testament, we are seeing God's special providence working in the nation of Israel. Now, we're going to talk about, let's finish, let's kind of think about this. So God is working on behalf of the people of Israel to bring the Messiah, so he's going to protect them in a special way. He's going to work on their behalf in a special way. This is special providence going on. When do we start seeing, give me some examples of Bible events where you're like, yep, God's doing that because he's protecting and preparing Israel for the job of bringing the Messiah into the world. Where do you see God, you're going, the Bible clearly says God's doing this for Israel's behalf. Okay, well, obviously, it certainly goes back to Abraham, and we see that's exactly right. That's where the promise began, that I'm going to make you a great nation. But let's go to the great nation. Let's skip ahead. Okay, what in the book of Ezekiel are you talking about? Okay, the end of the book of Ezekiel, the restoration of Israel. Okay, let's hold on to that one. Let's start rewinding. Okay, between Abraham and the restoration of Israel from Babylonian captivity, where do we start seeing the clarity of, and let me just start with, let's go to Abraham. So we go here, and how does the children of Israel end up in Egypt? How does that happen? Who? It happened through Joseph. Remember the whole Joseph episode. So Joseph gets tossed in a hole. His brothers want to kill him. One of them says, "No, let's not kill him. Let's sell him." And so there's this Midianite caravan that comes by and takes him down to Egypt. Now, as we're looking back at everything going on, God's hand, as we see what happens with Joseph and the rest of the Israelites, God's hand's clearly involved there. But then we get down into Joseph's life, and you actually start seeing words, expressions, and God was with Joseph. And what did God do for Joseph that allowed him to go up to reach a certain level of status politically? Gave him abilities. Yeah, it said everything that he did basically turned to gold. And then, as Holly said, God gave him the ability to interpret dreams. And so it was through these dreams then that Pharaoh goes, "Oh, this is my guy. Oh, he's better than all the wise men that I have." And, the whole, the dream especially of the skinny cows coming up and eating the fat ones and all of that stuff. And so Joseph goes, yeah, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of bad stuff. And so there's this famine over the whole region, and only Egypt has food. And then So the brothers come down to get food from Egypt. And it turns into suddenly all of the children of all 12 brothers, all 11 brothers, all of them come down, and now they're in Egypt, and their life is preserved. Brother Barrett? Yep, the brother's called Israel. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. So this is the beginning of the nation then, of Israel. That's right. And so then they grow. Where do you see God's hand involved in some of this? Their women were really fertile, and it was just like, man, what is going on here? Well, God's keeping his promise to Abraham. And then, of course, as the nation gets to a point and Moses comes onto the scene, do you see God involving himself in anything in the book of Exodus? Yeah, I mean, first of all, you've got all of the plagues, but then you've got that moment of deliverance at the Red Sea. And here they are, their backs are against the Red Sea, and the powerful Egyptian army is closing in on them. God intervenes because God has a purpose, and that purpose is to preserve Israel, to bring the Messiah into the world. And so this is what you see. So then they come out of Egyptian captivity, and they're in the wilderness. And what does God do while they're in the wilderness? I mean, this massive humanity, maybe 2 million people. You can't feed 2 million people in the Negev desert. How do they survive that? Yeah, God's miraculous provision. He's preserving them. Why? Because everything about Israel is about the coming of Christ. And so he's preserving them. Then when they get over, finally after 40 years of wilderness wandering, and they come over into the promised land, the conquest we call it, you see anything God intervening there on anything? Okay, if they obey him, they won. Where's the first? Let's think about them winning. Where's the first place that they came to when they came to the promised land? Jericho. Anything, any special providence happening there? Well, yeah. You can't miss that. And so you just keep going down through Israel's history, and you see God working and working and working and working and working because he has a special purpose to fulfill. And so we see him especially involved in Israel's life that way. And he can control the fortunes of nations. He can change anything that he wants, anytime that he wants, to accomplish his purpose. And he controls nations by controlling individuals. When he needs to step in and change something, he'll do it. Whether it's Pharaoh, whether it's Joseph and his brothers, whether it's Nebuchadnezzar, that is special providence. And then we come to, let's go back to Ezekiel now, and the restoration from exile, Babylonian captivity. God said 150 years before that happened in the book of Isaiah, God said, I have a special servant by the name of Cyrus that I'm going to use. Well, 150 years later, Cyrus is the king of Persia who's just defeated Babylon, and the text says there in Ezra that God moved his heart. And now the children of Israel get to go back and to rebuild their country and to rebuild Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. And so you're just seeing God's involvement in all of this. And so the message is really clear as we're reading the New Testament. And that is, God uses people and he uses nations to bring about his purposes for Israel. Because Israel is the country that he has, the nation that he raised up to prepare the way for the coming Messiah. Now, obviously, Now, the ultimate goal to even bring a Messiah in the world is ultimately for His glory. And as we think about this, I think we need to understand something that's very important. And I think a lot of people here misunderstand some things as they watch God involving Himself in Israel's, Old Testament Israel, just always involved in their deliverance, in their protection. What's typically something that maybe somebody is reading that and they say, well, God did this for Israel, God did that for Israel, God did this for Israel, and wow, look at all the things. And they might draw the conclusion that of what? Anybody got any clue? I don't even. You may not have any clue where I'm going on this. So let me just tell you what I'm trying to say. A lot of the people see that and they think God involves Himself like that in just like that in every nation of the world. Well, God must do that everywhere. Like America. There's no difference between Israel and America. Or whatever country you live in. That God is doing the exact same thing all over the world in every generation, at every time, with every nation. That kind of is the temptation that a lot of people have. But what we have to understand, and I'm not saying that God doesn't work in every nation. He does. He most certainly does. God is at work throughout the world, but we're going to get to that in just a minute. But we have to understand, we have to resist the temptation to generalize the data about God's involvement with Israel in the Old Testament and then draw conclusions about how He works with every other nation at every other time. We have to resist that and understand that His dealing with Israel was unique. Because Israel was unique. We can't forget that. Israel wasn't just one nation among many. Israel had a very, very special, unique purpose in the plan of God and in the purposes of God. Israel, as a nation in the Old Testament, they were in the role of preparer for the Messiah. God chose them to prepare for the Messiah. And so that role could only be given to one nation. And God gave that to the nation of Israel. And so God chose Israel for that privilege to serve in that very, very special role. And so, there's no reason to really think that God, is dealing was somewhere in the world dealing with the continent of Australia in the same way that He was dealing with the nation of Judah at that time. There's no reason to think that. Israel was very unique and very special. And more importantly, there's no reason to think that God is working with any other nation today as He did with Israel in Old Testament times. Again, notice that I didn't say, don't think that God's working with nations today. God's working everywhere today in His special providence to accomplish His purposes for His glory. But there is no parallel in our times when it comes to a political, geographic kingdom. There is no parallel in our times. Israel in the Old Testament was unique. Brother Barrett. Yep. Mm-hmm. That is exactly right. And so as we think about that, We come over into the New Testament then. So God has to involve himself, and we see this all throughout the Old Testament. He involves himself in a very unique way with Israel and all of the Old Testament nations around Israel at that time. He's manipulating things often in Israel and all around Israel at that time because he has a unique purpose for Israel. And they have a very special role in preparing for the Messiah. And so God's doing all of that. But Israel then is, and this is why, by the way, last week, if you were here on Sunday night, one of the questions we do, if you're not here usually on Sunday night or if you're visiting with us, people will submit questions, and on Sunday nights I'll sometimes answer those questions. And we did one last week where a person was asking, how should Christians respond to Israel today? And, and there's a lot of people today who have misunderstood the political nation of Israel today. And it is not the equivalent to Old Testament Israel. Today, modern political Israel is not the same as Old Testament Israel. Old Testament Israel, as I said last Sunday night, accomplished its purpose and fulfilled its role that God gave them, and that was to be the one who prepares for the Messiah. And so Israel served its purpose as a nation, as a political entity. Israel served its purpose. And Israel fulfilled her destiny. Her destiny was to bring Messiah into the world. And that destiny was fulfilled. And again, as I said though last week, don't misunderstand me there. You're not going to find a more pro-Israel guy than I am. And I'm as pro-Israel as they come, because they are a constitutional democracy. They are the only constitutional democracy in the Middle East. Their view toward human rights and certain freedoms, we share those same values. And their enemies are our enemies. Because the people who want to erase them from the face of the earth, guess what? They want to erase us from the face of the earth as well. I was reading about the Ayatollah just today, and threatening the severe, what's going to be unleashed against Israel and the United States, the great Satan. And so, you're not going to find a person more pro-Israel than I am. But it's not because, as I said last night, it's not because of theological reasons. Theologically, Israel fulfilled her destiny. And, Israel served the purpose that God created them for. And all that is fulfilled at the cross. And they foreshadowed. Do you remember what I said at the end of those of you who were here last Sunday night? At the end, I said, the Israel foreshadows the coming of what nation in the New Testament? The what? Yes, the Christians, the church, the kingdom of God. It's not a geographical kingdom. It's not a political entity. It's a spiritual kingdom. And it's worldwide. There are no borders. There are no boundaries. But it's the language. We looked in Philippians. We can see it in the book of Romans. In the book of Galatians, Paul emphasizes repeatedly, we are the true circumcision. We are the true Israel of God. And so when we think about God's involvement then in the Old Testament, when we see this intense involvement in Old Testament Israel and all of the nations that surrounded Israel, and him protecting Israel in a very special way, it was because he had a special purpose for him. They were the ones through whom the Messiah was going to come. But now, as we think about his protection of and blessing of Israel, so that Israel could fulfill its Old Testament destiny and purpose, we now think in terms of the fuller kingdom of God, the church. And so as we think about God's special providence, I think what we need to understand is that that God's special providence on behalf of his people today, his people is the church today. When we think of that, first of all, we have to understand that the church's purpose is different from old Israel. Our purpose is not, Israel's purpose was to bring the Messiah into the world. What is our purpose? What's our commission? Do what? Take the Messiah to the world. Make disciples. That's our commission. And so God is still, he's accomplishing his purpose. So he created the nation of Israel, and you see his special providence all throughout the Old Testament as he's protecting and preserving them to accomplish their purpose of bringing Messiah. And then we see him, accomplishing his purpose of sending Messiah to the cross as redemption for us, and the establishment of the church in Acts chapter 2, and then the growth of the church throughout the world. And so as we think about God now protecting and preserving his people, not a political nation, because, again, the Old Testament Israel doesn't have a New Testament, not a complete parallel in the New Testament, because it's a physical political kingdom. The church is not a physical political kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. But we think about God is still, though, accomplishing his purpose. So the purpose was to bring the Messiah. And now that continues to take the Messiah into the world until ultimately, at the end of time, Messiah reigns and all things are under the Messiah's authority. And everything and everyone submits to the Messiah. And so God is still exercising his special providence for within us as his people to so that we can to aid us in accomplishing our mission, just like he did to help Israel as a nation in the Old Testament accomplish its mission. We have a mission, and so as we think about that, what are some of the things that we can think about maybe how does God's special providence work as we think about his purpose of expanding the kingdom to the world? What are some of the things that God does to do that?
I have been so blessed to be a part of missions work and how God got me started in that, which is a whole story. But I just came back from World Bible School last week. I just ended my full-time career there. But we have a collection of people at World Bible School, and they speak of this, of the providence of God putting that team together.
Yeah.
And when you leave these walls and you visit other congregations in the country, or you visit congregations that are worshiping today in Zambia or Zimbabwe or wherever people go, you see God's purpose and providence in there. And if you'll be aware of it, he'll use you in certain places. Because I know he's done that for me.
Amen.
In so many ways. And it just strengthens your faith, and it shows that we are a kingdom of ourselves in the church. I love America, but I pray for God's providence and his blessings on the remnant of this country to keep doing what we can do. He just works in so many ways. We too often think, I wish he'd do a miracle right here. Well, I would rather have God's providence than this so-called maybe miracle.
Yeah, David, I think you're absolutely right. And your discussion of and what you just shared about World Bible School and the things happening there reminds me, when I go to the benefit dinners, I don't ever get tired of hearing those stories, because you you honestly cannot deny God's special providence. And again, this is all about, so God is preserving Old Testament, the national Israel, protecting and preserving it so that it can accomplish its purpose. Now, his people is the church, a spiritual kingdom, and God is working his special providence to accomplish his purpose through his people. And so, yeah, you hear these amazing stories of how people came to know Christ that were the most unlikely person to ever know Christ, and then how God used them to open doors and to spread the gospel. You know, Paul, he talks about in places like 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 12, that he encourages the church to pray that God will open doors. Well, that's special providence. He's asking that God will work in whatever way he does to open these doors of opportunities so that Paul can talk about opportunities that God is sharing. Yeah, you mentioned, I'm like you, I love America. I love America, and like so many of you, I wore the uniform and proudly wore the uniform. And I'm hoping for the absolute best. I think, our culture has been overall, are there terrible skeletons in the closet? Of course. We're broken humanity. Are there shameful, embarrassing parts of our past and present? Yes, of course. Of course. But the American ideal has been a blessing to all over the world. And there's a reason why, people still will sacrifice everything to try to get here. And I love America. But listen, what I want more than, and I think I'm doing God's will when God says, like he told the people who were going into Babylonian captivity, you do your best for the well-being of the country. And I'm going to do my best for the well-being of the country. But at the end of the day, I am first and foremost a citizen in the kingdom of God. And I'm going to leave it to God, whatever is best. And I don't know always what's best. I leave that to God. There may be some things that I think are just awful that God's going, no, yeah, I'm going to use that in different ways. And so I just leave it to God. I do what I can see in my limited perspective, but I want the gospel to continue. It's kind of like, to be honest, when I pray for God, I don't personally pray that all of the politicians in Washington will become dedicated New Testament Christians. Is that bad? That I don't pray that? I would like for them to all become dedicated New Testament Christians. But I'm going to tell you, I don't think they're all going to become dedicated New Testament Christians. I don't believe that for a second. Just the way politics works as a system. Paul doesn't even tell us to pray that. You know what Paul tells us to pray in like when he talks about pray for kings and everybody who's in authority? It's over in 1 Timothy chapter 1 if you want to take a look at that. 1 Timothy chapter 1, notice what he says here. He says, chapter 2, rather, verse 1, first of all, then I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions, and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. He says, and basically, as you kind of keep reading this, and you see what God's purpose for everything is, because in verse 4 he says, who desires all men to be saved and to come to knowledge of the truth. He says, pray that the setting in which you live will be characterized, that it will be an environment by which you can go about your business as a Christian. That's kind of kingdom view there. I want decisions to be made that facilitate the spread of the gospel. And yes, I've got to be honest. There's some perspectives, some views out there as we become far more secular that I think are religious freedoms are in jeopardy, going to be in jeopardy someday, and going to make it far more difficult. And that preaching the truth regarding God's will, whether it's about sexuality or anything, can become a crime. That's a scary thought, and I want it to be, and that will that help or hinder the gospel? And some places it's probably helped the gospel, other places it hinders the gospel, and so we just don't have can't see all of those things with clarity. But I like what he says here, and I appreciate what he says here. We want to have a setting in which we live, an environment that we can live freely and peacefully for kingdom purposes, and because this and I think God intervenes in His special providence to accomplish things like that that facilitate. Hey, the very fact of and as you look at the American exceptionalism and historically, and how our freedom and our wealth has resulted in world missions on a scale that was never heard of before. And so you can't help but to see God's providential hand working to provide an infrastructure for spreading the gospel. It's kind of like Jesus being born in the time of the Romans. The Roman culture and Roman setting actually facilitated the spread of the gospel because it was called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Rome was dominant, and they could put down rebellions, and so there was this general peace over the civilized world, and they had infrastructure where people could travel, and so you had this pagan government that was in charge, and yet it was in many ways perfectly suited for the beginning of the growth of the church. And so, God's hand, as He's prophesying in the Old Testament, when He's going to raise up at the kingdom. Buddy, I saw your hand. Yep. Amen. Yeah, the story of Augustine. I mean, there's just so many, and you can see the hand of God working in that. And you can see then, does God then have His hand in political things to accomplish? Yeah, but again, what's the ultimate reason He might do that? For His ultimate purpose of promoting Christ and sending Christ to the world.
If I could add, as awful as this country is morally right now, there's never been a greater time in this world and in the history of this country financially for us to take the gospel.
You're right.
To do a better job with our own neighbors,
yep.
Our own country, but never has there been more wealth to share the gospel
yep.
around the world.
That's right. Wealth, technology, and all that. You're absolutely right. And as we think of technology, you see God's providential hand in that, kind of in the West, as far as the West has gone away from abandoned God. Yet it's through the values of Western civilization that innovation came about, that allowed for whether it was early days, the printing press, or now the internet, to be tools used for the God. You just don't have, and so God, we talk about God's general providence in weather, but they could use that general providence in controlling weather events. He may, and we, there may be a near miss on someone in weather-wise. Is God's hand maybe in that because it was somehow in God's using it to for His purpose in the kingdom? Yeah, it sure is possible. Now, here's the thing. Let me say this as we finish up this. We acknowledge then, so God, we know God's involved. We think of it more, though, and what we need to think of it more now is, don't forget, it's to accomplish His purpose. And His purpose is now accomplished not through a particular political entity like it was in the Old Testament, but now through His spiritual kingdom, the church. But God can be involved in anything to accomplish that purpose. But here's the thing. A lot of times we can say, as we have, oh, clearly God's providence is working here when we hear these stories and all. Sometimes all we can do is say perhaps. Paul, as he's writing to Philemon, one of the things that he says there is when he sends Onesimus back to Philemon, and he said, it is perhaps for this reason that, a lot of people call that the providential perhaps. I like that. Even Paul didn't know. Is God's hand in this? I don't know. People a lot of times ask me to interpret providence for them. And I can't. Hey, this tree fell this way instead of that way. What do you think that means, Dan? And I'm like, I don't, it just may have been a gust of wind blew it that way. I'm not sure it meant anything. And I say, listen, I can't interpret providence. And if you want to save yourself a lot of frustration and anxiety, stop trying to interpret providence. It's just, now again, some things after the fact we look at and go, I believe God was involved in that. And we praise Him and give Him all the credit for it. But I'm amazed, we sometimes we just bog ourselves down. Hey, does God want me to take this job or this job? And my answer to people is, hey, listen, you just pray about it and then you choose whatever job you want to. If God wanted you to do something, God would tell you what it is in His Word. Does God want me to move to Montana or Iowa? Listen, there's some decisions that, they're your decisions. If you move to Montana, glorify God there. If you move to Iowa, glorify God there. Pray about it. Consult godly people that you have confidence in certain things. Then make a decision. And don't agonize and think, you move to Iowa and things kind of go south on something. You go, oh no, I must have went against God's will. No. God's not punishing you for that. It don't matter if you move to Montana or Iowa. Some things bad are going to happen because you live in a sinful, broken world. Try not to interpret providence. Okay. Well, we'll talk more about, we'll get into, finish up special providence next week, talk a little bit about miracles, and I'll see you. Have a great day. Hope I'll see you tonight at 6 o'clock.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Appreciate you.